Yes.
And it's a
Yes.
treat to have each of you on the screen as a context for the study of Psalm 76. I had a teacher who was very influential in my younger days. He taught philosophy at Hebrew University. His name was Dr. David Hartman. And he was particularly at that time focused on scholarship of Maimonides. And David Hartman said, if you want to know somebody, examine, ask them what's their dream, what's their ultimate goal. And that's a quick way to know who somebody is. And he said that in reference to teaching the 10th chapter of the Talmud in Sanhedrin, where the rabbis describe the world to come. I mentioned that image. If you want to know somebody, ask them their dream. In that Psalm 76, which is a continuation of Psalm 75, many commentators would say, is a description of end of days. Acharit hayamim, the end of days. You may recall from Psalm 75 that it's a psalm of God's triumph over the arrogant. In this case, Psalm 70 and a sense of the peace of Israel, peace of Jerusalem. That was Psalm 75. And all the Psalms can be read and have been read as eschatological, meaning looking forward to the end of days, is often the case. And so Psalm 76 has a trajectory that will lead us toward all kings coming to praise God. In that sense, it's a dream fulfilled with verse 10, when arising to judgment, God will deliver all the humble of the earth. The contrast between the arrogant, who have the horns, their horns, their symbol of pride, their symbol of aggression, that God at the end of Psalm 75 cuts off of the arrogant. In Psalm 76, God, in verse 10, will deliver the humble, the anav. Now, to be humble, we've seen that word before. In King James gets translated as the meek, but in the rabbinic understanding, anav, which again has a synonym of meek, is not weak. It's not lowering oneself in that regard. Anav, and Richard Levy in his commentary to this psalm will make that his key focus. What is an anav? As an aspiration of whom God seeks to deliver. The anav is the one who lives in a balance of life, knowing one's own mortality, one's own creatureliness, and that giving context to a faith in God who transcends place and time, and who is a God of justice. So let me read the psalm, and then I'll start over talking about some of the other commentaries as to what is the moment or the springboard for this psalm. I mentioned that this was an easier psalm to get our heads around, and that it's only 13 verses. I pick a verse from toward the end, in which God is called Hanorah, which a number of translators translate as awesome one. That same word Norah, which will appear several times in the psalm, can also be the fearsome one. I'll return. Now, beginning Psalm 76. For the conductor with niginot, a psalm of Asaph, a song. Known in Judah is God, among Israel, great is God's name, and it is. In Salem, God's shelter and God's dwelling place in Zion. There God smashed fiery arrows of the bow, shield and sword and the battle, Selah. Illuminated are you and mightier than the mountains of prey. Bereft of sense were the stubborn of heart. They rested into a trance, and none could find of all the powerful people their hands. From your rebuke, God of Jacob, they were stunned. The chariot and the horse, you awesome are you, and who may stand before you when you are angry? From heaven, you caused to be heard a legal decree. The earth was awestruck and stilled when arising to judgment, God, to deliver all the humble of the earth. For the wrathful of humanity shall praise you. A remnant of wrath you will gird about you. Vow and pay to Adonai your God. Let all those around God bring tribute to the awesome one. God plucks the life breath of princes, awesome to the kings of the earth. I'm rewriting this last phrase to being a semicolon, then a capital. Awesome is the kings of the earth. In doing that, as I read these Psalms, I constantly am tweaking them in my mind in order for there to be a flow. This particular Psalm, not unlike many, has a number of rich but obscure metaphors, and in which the Hebrew grammar is also a bit awkward at times, leading to multiple translations. I'll give some examples with keeping an eye on the key question as we read our Psalms, and that is, how is this Psalm relevant to us? But a place to begin is first with some of the micro-analysis. So a little bit of the analysis word by word. This first word, limenatseach, I tend to translate for the conductor. And the image is the Psalms have an orchestra often with niginot, the second word, that seems to be with instruments. That's how Radak understands it. Often translators will translate it as with string instruments, which were the most common of instruments of that time. But we really don't know precisely what the niginot were, so I keep it as niginot. But the idea of conductor, this word limenatseach, appears 55 times, meaning more than a third of the Psalms has that as part of its introduction. Here's an example of how such a common word can be understood in so many different ways. So the Talmud, Pesachim 119a, will say limenatseach means for victory. The Vulgate, the earliest of the Latin translations of the Bible, will translate it as for victory. The Targum, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Targum today. I like to always introduce some of our commentators. So the Targum, hold the name, I'll come back to who the Targum is, will translate limenatseach for praise, because Hallel, Tehillim are for praise. So limenatseach, for praise. But back to most translating it as for the singer, for the director, for the conductor, for the lead musician. Those are the most common translations. And that's Radak. Radak is probably the most quoted classic commentator of Psalms. Again, he lived in France, Narbonne, France, 1160 to 1235. And he understood niginot, understood limenatseach, the first word, as musical director. And the image, and I've chosen conductor, is as the one in charge, in that sense, the director. But today, it's the one who's actively leading, so the conductor. For the conductor with niginot, a psalm of Asaph, and we have 11 psalms by Asaph. 10 of them are in this flow of these psalms. And now let's begin with the psalm itself. Known in Judah is God among Israel. Great is God's name. Some commentators see Judah and Israel as two different names of the people of Israel. Others see them geographically. And if it's geographic, like for Benjamin Siegel, that would point to an earlier psalm, as if the 10 northern tribes were still in recent memory. But most commentators see these Judah and Israel as simply parallel. It is in Salem, God's shelter, and God's dwelling place in Zion. So Salem, that is an image to victory. And there will be, not unlike yesterday, certain biblical references that point to past victories. Salem is only mentioned once. It's Genesis 14:18. It's in regard to Abraham in the immediate aftermath of his battles with the kings on behalf of his captive nephew Lot. And it will say of Melchizedek, who comes to bring an offering of goodwill to Abraham, that he was from Salem, like Salem, Massachusetts. That's where it gets its name from. And the rabbis will understand Salem and Melchizedek, whose name can be translated as the King of Justice, as Jerusalem. And in fact, later, now I'm going fast forward into the Middle Ages, the Tosafot, which is Rashi's grand commenting in the Talmud, Tanit 16a, will say that the name Jerusalem is the conflation of Shalem, where Melchizedek was, and the same place, which is called in Genesis 22:14, Yirah, the place of awe, that Abraham called a place, and Yirah and Shalem becomes Yerushalayim. So back to verse 3. It's a reference to victory. It's also a reference to Jerusalem, and that's the parallel, Salem and Zion. Sion being, Ir Tzion, David's city, Salem being the old name for Jerusalem. But again, it's only used one other time in the Bible, Shalem, which is to say, the psalmist is choosing words that have this resonance of the past and victory. There God smashed fiery arrows of the bow, shield and sword, and the battle. So here is God as warrior. Probably the most pronounced place you get God as warrior is in the Song of the Sea. And you'll see resonances in Psalm 7 and 8 for that psalm of victory. Here in Deuteronomy 32:24, there is an image of burning fire, uchamei reshef, and therefore this word rishpeh, only used that one time in Deuteronomy. Again, poet choosing rare words, are part of the statement by Moses of how God will punish the wicked with a fever. And therefore, that's why many translations put in fiery here. Some do thunderbolts of the bow. But there is the sense of the one place it's used in Deuteronomy, rishpeh, that there's a sense of fire about it. But here you get in verse 4 the image of God as smashing the enemy, God as warrior, which I'll now pause to share some of the comments of what is it that prompts this moment. For some, the reference in 3 and then 4, and you'll see it as it continues with this 3 different words for sleep in verses 6 and 7, refers to a theme we've seen before, which is the battle of Sennacherib, who in the second book of Kings, verses 18 to 20, does a siege around Jerusalem. The Assyrians, who had conquered the northern 10 tribes, come south, and then mysteriously, as the siege seems effective and they're ready to take Jerusalem, they disappear. They leave, either because of a plague or because of a battle elsewhere. Historians aren't exactly sure. But the prophet Isaiah, chapters 36 and 37, will also describe this miraculous victory over Sennacherib of Assyria. So this could be looking back. Some say that is what prompts this. We don't know. Others look forward, and they see this as the battle in the future of Gog and Magog. That's Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. It's the battle before the end of days. And the rest of Ezekiel 40 to 43 describes the rebuilt temple of the future. That battle of Gog and Magog described by Ezekiel will become very important in the New Testament in the book of Revelations, chapter 16, 19, 21. Armageddon, the word Armageddon from Megiddo, the place Megiddo, which is where the battle will take place. Already in the 10th century, 11th century, Rav Hai Gaon, he's the last of the Gaonim of Pumbedita, the academy in Baghdad. He will identify the timing of that final battle to be Sukkot, the holiday of Sukkot, which is why now moving into the 18th century, the Vilna Gaon will say Psalm 76 is to be recited on the first day of Sukkot. So this could be looking backwards to the battle of Sennacherib, or all of it could be eschatological, the looking forward to the end of days, according to the classic commentators. And this is a description of a future battle, the battle of Gog and Magog. Verse 5, illuminated are you and mightier than the mountains of prey. That's one of those metaphors, mightier than the mountains of prey. What are the mountains of prey? Steinsaltz will say, tall and threatening as mountains where beasts of prey roam. So mountains of prey are mountains of danger in the wild. God is mightier than even that quality of fear that comes with traversing such a mountain of beasts. Martin Cohen will say that this describes or is a metaphor for the mountains of slaughter on which the enemies fell, that the prey here is the enemy. Again, metaphors with opportunities of interpretation. Verses 6 and 7, that's why it links also to Sennacherib. Remember, the troops had encircled Jerusalem and somehow they were impotent and they left. In 6 and 7, the 3 key words are 3 different words for sleep. There's a popular lullaby in Israel, Numi, Numi, Yaldati. I think it's by same person who did Jerusalem of Gold. A popular melody of earlier in her career, May You Sleep, My Child. So that's Namu, Shinatai. Say again?
Naomi Shemer.
Yeah, I just drew a blank for a moment.
I know.
So Naomi Shemer, one of Israel's great singers. So that's a popular lullaby that she wrote using the word numi, here namu. Then shena is sleep, and lirdame is to go to sleep in verse 7. And so, bereft of sense were the stubborn of heart. They rested into a trance. Second. And none could find of all the powerful people their hands. They were helpless. From your rebuke, God of Jacob, they were stunned, the chariot and the horse. And here, the chariot and the horse, Rechav Vasus, echoes the song of the sea. Verse 8, you awesome are you, and who may stand before you when you are angry? Me'az apecha, when you are angry, or from the strength of your anger, is also a phrase in the song of the sea. Mishamayim, from heaven you caused to be heard a legal decree. The earth was awestruck and stilled when rising to judgment, God, to deliver all the humble of the earth. So the trajectory of the battles is to lead to judgment. That's the surface reading. The medieval commentators will put this at Mount Sinai, verse 9. But in its context, it's God, you cause to be heard a legal decree, as if the psalmist again is imagining himself in the end of days, in which, building on 75, the arrogant have been punished, and God has done battle fearsomely with these echoes of God's power from the song of the sea, of Abraham's victory over the kings of his day, leading to verse 10, somewhat the punchline, for arising to judgment, God, to deliver all the humble of the earth. That is again where God's focus is, on those who are with humility, the anav. In our tradition, particularly in the Hasidic tradition, skipping fast forward to a period of great spiritual piety, to be an anav is to be somebody who doesn't seek to call attention to him or herself, who seeks to see oneself as God's servant, doing good in the world on behalf of God. And so that's the trajectory of these battles. And the last three verses even more have this image of the completion of battle, of an end of days, of a harmony that is, if you will, the postscript to having delivered the humble. For the wrathful of humanity shall praise you. So even those who lived angrily, they too will praise you. And a remnant of wrath, playing on this word of anger, chemot, meaning that God will still retain the ability to strike. You will gird about you. So God will be recognized as still having the power to act with anger. And now a statement, verses 12, to the world. Vow and pay to Adonai your God. Let all those around God bring tribute to the awesome one. And so what is distinctive in the Jewish tradition, what's distinctive in Psalms, is that the God is the God of Zion, the God of Jerusalem, the God of the Jewish people, but it's a God of justice who judges all people and to whom all will one day pay tribute, enabling a world of oneness, a world of harmony. God plucks the life breath of princes, which is to say God is more mighty than any human person or power, awesome, fearsome to the kings of the earth. All will know that the ultimate King of kings is God. Now, Radak That's David Kimchi, 1160-1235 in France. He'll say, as is seen in the prophets, all nations will recognize God with tribute. And that's how you paid tribute. You brought gifts to Norah, Morah. But Morah can be a teacher. Morah with an aleph is awesome. Awe can be awful as well as awesome or fearsome. It's about God being wrapped in wrath. God is judge. And now a word about Targum, who I opened with. Targum is the translator of the Bible into Aramaic. He was called Onqelos, or Aqiles of Sinope. Onqelos the proselyte lived in Israel 35 to 120. The early rabbis will describe him as a convert from Roman nobility. They'll differ if he was related to the Emperor Titus. Some will say he was related to the Emperor Hadrian, which is of a little bit of a later period. But he will translate the Bible into Aramaic, which was the common language of the Near East at the time. That's the reason the Kaddish is in Aramaic. And I pause to tell you a little bit about Onqelos, the translator, which is called the Targum, because he will comment verses 12 and 13 that the nations will bring sacrifices to the temple. So it's not only that the nations will, for him, recognize God, but he takes it even more concretely to say that the temple in Jerusalem will become indeed that place which Isaiah had described as a place where all people will bring offerings. And I maybe, in my own mind, see Targum with his background as a Jew by choice being even more identified with the kings of the world more concretely, going to the temple and bringing offerings. And mind you, Onqelos, at least at the beginning of his life, because he's born in the year 35, the temple existed, though he probably did the translation in the shadow of the destruction of the temple. Maimonides will say that you should every Friday prepare for the Parsha, for the reading of Torah, by not only reading it twice in Hebrew, but once in Aramaic using Onkelos' translation, which is still the custom of the Jews of Yemen, who are living in Israel primarily. They'll read Onkelos every Friday. And so this is an opportunity to acknowledge Onkelos. To pull together Psalm 76 on this Hanukkah 7th day is a psalm of celebration, a psalm of victory, seeing God as doing battle for the humble, doing battle with a trajectory of seeking a world united in which all will recognize that justice is at the center of how God, the Creator, rules the world. Reason where I started, when you ask, what is the dream of the psalmist? And frankly, what's the dream, the spiritual dream of the Jewish people? It's at the center of the Amidah. It's to create a world of peace, a world redeemed, where the Creator will create a unity, and that those who are the arrogant, those who see power as only in human hands, with no one watching, back to 75, those people, they will fall into their own traps, their own pride will do them in, and that God, who has shown through the past, helping Abraham to victory, helping the Israelites to freedom, that God, those memories of the past give hope to us now, that the future will be a time of final harmony marked by God's victory. And so, with that, Psalm 76, another good choice for Hanukkah in terms of a psalm of victory, of harmony, of the promise of a world as one. Any comments or questions that come looking at Psalm 76?
Hi, Ellie.
Yes, Hal.
So coming to listen to you read each psalm every morning, it amazes me that the infinite number of images and their variety of references. Basically, what comes to me this morning is that every psalm we read is really about the same topic, that is the awesomeness of God. And so it's just amazing that we come every morning and there are more, a larger variety, and it just builds each morning on what has come before. And as a poet, this psalmist is just amazing in that the images build on one another and still about the one topic, which is God's greatness.
Yeah. So let me build on that, Hal, and thank you. I too am continued, I've only grown in my sense of passion for the Psalms by virtue of the passion being conveyed. These are very passionate poems, and they're about, as you say, Hal, about God's awesomeness, in that the Psalms are addressing God, and God is the source of wonder in the world. But what's distinctive about it is it's not just about nature, which is how a lot of people think about God. God is the source of the beauty around us. This is about God, who is the source of justice and the promise of a world in which the humble will be safe and honored. And those who don't feel accountable, that's who the arrogant are. And that's why at the end in this psalm, God plucks the breath of princes, which is to say, those who are the princes, those who wield the political power, ultimately their ruach, their spirit, their breath is transient. It's God who will have ultimate say. So again, about wonder and God's awesomeness, but an awesomeness of morality at the center, as well as the beauty of creation. Richard, you've unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
On verse 9,
Yeah.
Let's see, there. From heaven, you caused to be heard a legal decree.
Yeah.
And din is the Hebrew word there.
Yeah.
The way I might have understood that would be that perhaps this is a reference to Torah.
That's right.
But I'm also wondering, and in fact, you translated a legal decree. If there isn't an ambiguity here, that's a poetic ambiguity, and I'm wondering perhaps what legal decree you had in mind, if there was one, when you made it, or when you translated legal decree.
Yeah. So I chose legal decree rather than just a decree or simply saying heard a law, to create the sense of more of an active. So literally a din is a judgment. So a court will give its holding, its decree. In modern Hebrew, that's the din. What is the bottom line ruling, or if you will, God caused to be heard a ruling. But it's here in a legal sense. The classic commentators will again identify this with Mount Sinai, again replaying God's power of the past. But it can be in the future. Again, the point of view is the psalmist is writing as if the world is already a world post-apocalyptic. It's already a world of the Messianic era. That's the imagining, that's the dream that's being presented as if it's fulfilled as I read it. But here's something, a couple things, Richard, that you prompt, and that is in that, in verses 9, verse 10, and verse 13, a recurring word in each of those three will be the word eretz, land. So it's about a transformation of a land into peacefulness, and that's God's decree. But one other, those who see it as relating to Mount Sinai will say the earth was awestruck, yirah, that's, like shaking, and then it became stilled. And here's the Talmudic play. Shabbat 88a, Reish Lakish said, at Mount Sinai, God said to the Israelites, if you accept my Torah, all will be well, but if not, the world will return to its primordial disorder, into emptiness and formlessness, because the whole world was created for the sake of giving of Torah. And if you forsake it, it's as if there was no reason to have created the world. Now that's also very ethnocentric. The whole world was created in the Talmud for the giving of Torah. Those are the scholars of Torah, elevating the importance of their endeavor. But that allows me to share this tension, because in our world, the image of the end of days is everybody will have their own, do their own thing kind of thing. And that's tolerance and respect for difference. In the biblical image, it's everybody's going to know our God is the true God. And that God, that true God, is the God who spoke at Mount Sinai. And that's the purpose of creation, is to have God's voice be heard of law, of deen, of right and wrong. And again, I just come back, with this image of this is not only the awe or the praise of a beautiful world, this is the awe and praise of a world of moral order that we seek to celebrate as religious poetry. One last comment. It delights me to see you from New York. Go ahead, Chuck.
My comment is much more mundane. The second word, nigunot, the common word we use today is nigunim. And I'm wondering if nigunim is a more modern Israeli word, or if there's a nuanced difference between the two. I looked them both up on my phone translator, which is not very deep, and it translates them both as melody.
So that's right. So nigun literally means melody. It became more popularized as nigun being a melody without words in the Hasidic tradition. So there, the Hasidic teaching would be that what you would want to express at the deepest level transcends words. So this is back to the comment of Hal about, the sense of awe. You can't put awe into words. It transcends words. And so the Hasidic masters say that higher than prayer with words is a melody. And it was customary on Saturday afternoon at the final meal of Shabbat for the Hasidic Rebbe to teach Torah and to teach a melody that would be repeated over and over, creating kind of a mantra-like effect of altered state. And so Chuck, nigun became identified with that quality of melody, but it can also, in modern Hebrew, it can just be melody.
But my question was, why is there a feminine and a masculine version of this same word? And I'm wondering if nigunot was the common version at the time when the psalm was written, but
So
nigunim is the common version today.
that's very well said, and I don't know. I
Yeah,
do know that here niginot is usually translated as stringed instruments. So it's about the instruments, and that's in the feminine, and
right.
the melody may be in the masculine. So
That's
nigunim,
excellent.
yeah,
Yeah,
could be
I'll
the
check it
reason.
in Alkali
Okay,
later and see what that says.
good. Okay, Ahuva has the last comment regarding grammar or something else. Whatever Ahuva wants to comment, you get to comment, and then we'll pull it together.
Ibn Ezra, he reads neginot as how you translated it, Chuck, as melodies. So Lamenatseach is the one who's in charge of the melodies.
But and again, then it leaves with the question of Ahuva that Chuck raised is at least in modern Hebrew, or we would say nigunim, and here it's niginot. And so the question of why feminine versus masculine. So
it doesn't matter. In Hebrew, you have a lot of words that are masculine and feminine, like tzedek and tzedakah. You have it. It's sometimes there is some nuances that are different, but because the root is the same, the meaning is almost the same.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that the word negina, the way you read it, is old. It's not something new.
yes, no, but I say, but it became popularized as melody in the Hasidic circles. But as you say, Ahuva, its origin is ancient. And so with that, let me pull together Psalm 76, a rich psalm with allusions to the past, like the Song of the Sea, allusions perhaps to Mount Sinai, allusions to Abraham and Melchizedek of Shalem, and at the same time, a vision of the future, a vision of a world of harmony in which God is triumphant over arrogance. May we, on this, the seventh day of Hanukkah, have reason to be in celebration. With that, I thank each of you. Next week, it'll be just Tuesday and Wednesday, shorter, about this length on Tuesday. Wednesday is a very longer psalm, and that'll be a bit of a longer class, just a little. So I invite those saying Kaddish to join together to honor the memory of your loved one. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
Bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon yomechon ufchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehesh rabba mevarach olam omeo maya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh Vitadar, Vitale, Vitalal, Shemei de Kutsha Barichu, Le'elam Mikol Birchata, Shirata, Tushbechata, Venechemata, Damiran Yoma Vimru Amen. Yehe Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chayim Aleinu, V'yokol Yisrael, Vimru Amen. Ose Shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu yokol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. So to each of you, thank you for joining. Julie